Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drum McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. And now, here's your host, Drum McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our special guest today is Dr. Philip Dearborn, President of the Association of Biblical Higher Education. Philip has a storied legacy in higher ed, having served as provost of Lancaster Bible College, Capital Seminary and Graduate School for the past 5 years, and before that was recruiting students at their admissions office. He then made the transition to academic affairs, serving as the Registrar, Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs, Vice President of Academic Affairs, and Provost. A long career there at Lancaster. And now Dr. Dearborn has assumed the reins at ABHE, the largest association representing Christian higher education institutions. He succeeds Dr. Ralph Enlow as its president, who is at the helm since 2004. And we spoke to him about how COVID is changing Christian higher ed and what's in store at ABHE and in Christian higher ed. Philip, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Drum. Glad to be here.
Oh, good to have you too. We had a great conversation with Ralph Enlow, your predecessor, a few months ago, and really glad to have you on the show. Now, you've been on board now for what, about 3-4 months?
So I actually started just a couple of weeks ago. So I'm technically still in my first month. So July 1st was my start. However, I did have a bit of a break from my previous assignment as provost at Lancaster Bible College of a couple months. And though ABHE drew me in quickly, so I was working a bit before July 1st, but happy to be on board. Ralph is a fantastic man. I wish him the best in retirement. But he's handed me what I refer to as a turnkey operation.
Well, he did a fabulous job there. Big shoes, which I know you'll be able to fill, but I don't expect to see him fade away. I suspect Ralph is going to fail when it comes to retirement.
Yeah, I'm not sure he understands what that word is. Give him a couple months, and I think he'll be knocking on somebody's door. So I know we'll use him at ABHE. Plenty of opportunities to do that.
Well, he's a great man, and he's done such a great thing. I mean, he was with ABHE for 15, 16 years, I believe, was he not?
He was, yep. And was also serving at CIU for a number of years. Our paths are very similar, where he served as a provost at CIU before coming on to become the president of ABHE, and similar with me coming from LBC as provost over to the president of ABHE.
Well, he's done a great job there at ABHE. He's built a wonderful team that you're inheriting, and you'll do fabulously there.
Thank you, Drum.
You're in the first 100 days, and of course, your first 100 days looks very different than most people's first 100 days because of COVID and everything else. So where do you go from here? I mean,
yeah, it's
a new normal.
It really is, and I'm not even sure when that normal will come, if at all. But COVID has definitely thrown things into a bit of a. I like to see it. I'm the eternal optimist, so it's great opportunity. This has come our way. So then, how do we navigate through that? Because our purpose, our mission, our vision, who we are, that doesn't change. The circumstances have changed. So we need to be nimble enough to now say, how do we now move forward as an organization? And great example is my colleague, Dave Metters, who's a gem of a guy, with using Zoom for all of our meetings and our conferences and our leadership development. How do we do that better? And so he went out, raised the funds, and in the month of August, we're installing a state-of-the-art Zoom room to make sure that we have the right technology to be able to deliver everything that we deliver. So yeah, we've had to be nimble. And I'll be honest with you, Drum, I put together my goals for my board for my first 100 days. I had 8 of them, and I had to include a paragraph at the top that said, all of this may or may not happen depending on what happens with COVID and our member schools. Had to add that caveat, but it is definitely changing, no question, the landscape of higher education in general, certainly biblical higher education then as well.
It's so critical too for change. I mean, Gordon Gee, the president of West Virginia University, and he's been university president for over 40 years. So you'd think by then he would have gotten it right. He's been a guest on the podcast a couple of times, and he made a comment to me that was like, wow, this is really true. He said, the COVID crisis is accelerating the needed changes in higher ed by at least 10 years.
Wow. I'd agree with him. There's no question about it. And I see higher education as a bit of a lag industry, where in the midst of these changes, you're looking at some of the early enrollment numbers. It's hard to know what's going to happen here in August, September. Some early indications, obviously, with deposits and that sort of thing, but you really never know until you see the whites of their eyes that they're on campus.
Or on Zoom.
Exactly. I think it's going to be a bit of time here within the sector of higher education for us to kind of find our way and know what the ultimate impact is going to be on us. It's an interesting day. I was with a college president just a couple weeks ago. His perspective, which I kind of like, he said, we're just planning that it's going to be difficult and we've just got to make it work until August 2021. And then we'll have an opportunity. If we can make it to then we'll have an opportunity to kind of see what the future is. But that's the kind of planning that's happening now. In the day of, what's your 5-year plan? Well, good grief. I think now where's your 1 month plan?
In some with the crisis going on, especially in the early days, it was like, what's your 1 hour plan?
Yeah. And, you hear amazing stories of colleges where the faculty just stepped up with the staff, with the administration to just make it happen. Those kinds of situations have a shelf life to them. People rise to the occasion, but to expect them to continue at that level for a sustained period of years, it's simply not going to happen. Yeah, there was that initial rush and everyone pulling together, let's make this work. But here we are now in July going into August with a very, very uncertain fall. So we're going to be dipping into that well again.
You're absolutely right. And it was interesting because I read an article from the Chronicle a couple of months ago. It was a typical Wednesday. Goldie, and I don't remember Goldie's last name, but she writes some wonderful pieces for them. She was talking about how challenging it's going to be because the faculty culture has become so entrenched in many ways that, yes, there will be a surge there to move classes online, etc. But ultimately, the culture, because it's so ingrained, embedded in what they do, it's going to be very difficult to make changes. Frankly, I agree.
Yeah, no question about it. And that to me is some of the lag of higher education as an industry. Those issues have to settle themselves out on our campuses. And obviously, different sectors of higher education respond differently with whether the faculty are unionized, not unionized. That brings a whole nother level of complexity to the situation and trying to navigate through it. But it's going to take some significant time once a vaccine, once a whatever is announced and happens, and we quote unquote are over COVID-19. The impact is going to be several years in the making.
It certainly is. To me, when I look at it, and I've got a science background, my undergraduate was in physics. Mm-hmm. When I look at it, COVID-19 really is a catalyst. COVID is not going to change. What are you going to do? It's creating major disruption, major change. And so how are institutions going to be able to continue to provide a good education for students that is relevant to where they need to go?
Yeah, and that's well said. And I'm kind of working with my team at ABHE. We have a retreat coming up here at the beginning of August. And outside of the normal things you do on a retreat of getting to know each other and how do we work well together, we're actually bringing in somebody to just give us a common language as a tool set on scenario planning. That has gotten a lot of lip service, and appropriately so. It could be the next tragedy that happens. That it's not going to stop. We have a history of these things happening and it impacting our culture, our society, higher education. So then a lesson learned, at least for me in this and working with my team, is we need to be nimble. We need to have a shared language on what is scenario planning. As we approach, what would happen if 20% of our membership dropped? What does that do to our business model? How do we respond in that situation? Because again, if our schools are on mission, the mission doesn't change. The Bible College movement has at its core the church, and the church is God's plan A. We are called to work with the church. Circumstances outside of our control are going to impact, but that doesn't make the mission go away. So based on these circumstances, then how should we respond, and how do we act, and what do we do next? And that's captured in scenario planning. It's a critical thing, and I'd encourage listeners to there's probably 6 or 7 different methodologies that you can use for scenario planning. Pick one, and it ought to be part of everyday language, so that as we as an organization are planning our annual meeting, well, we now have to think through multiple scenarios that we never had to think through before, from not having it to having it to some hybrid approach. But scenario planning gives you that tool set to be able to say, okay, how should we approach this? What's the best path forward?
Mm-hmm. I know our church, we have an annual convocation, usually the beginning of August, and it's held in downtown Los Angeles at one of the hotels. 3,000 to 5,000 people show up. Mm-hmm. It's being done via Zoom, YouTube, all video this year. Major thing, but that's what you've got to do. Yeah. I think on the other side, we met with our representative there in Orlando who hosts our annual meeting. And my heart just went out to that industry, that hotel. I mean, a place like Orlando is just devastated. Their whole industry is based off of these conferences coming in, and it's just decimated. I think on the other side of this, when folks are ready to travel again, and there's the funding to do it, there could be a significant resurgence of attendance at members' annual meetings, because you can accomplish a lot on Zoom. You really can. But there's something about that relational face-to-face that you just can't replicate. It's the conversations on the way to the main session. It's the connections that you make in an exhibit hall. It's that connection you make with somebody in a workshop that you simply can't do it in a Zoom environment. So I think there are elements that Zoom is good. We weren't designed for this. This isn't how we were designed to operate. And I believe some elements will be coming back, hopefully sooner than later. Yeah, I think we all hope that. But one of the things that's interesting is with a conference, you set aside 3-4 days, and it's your mind's out of the office. You're focused on different things. Mm-hmm. Zoom, you don't get a chance to do that. No, you're pretty much straight on. And how do you set aside 3 days for a conference? Yeah. The priorities is, we've got to get this done. We've got to get that done, rather than, planning ahead of time and maybe doing a few phone calls while you're away. Yeah. So Zoom, it's transactional. You conduct the business meeting, mm-hmm. But we all know that leadership relationships is much more than just the transactions that happen within the context of a meeting. And I found once you get above a certain number of people, you don't get the engagement either. Yeah. More than 5 people, people are zoning out. They're not fully engaged in the conversation. Yeah. You see people doing this, and kind of got that thousand yard stare because they're too busy taking care of that deliverable that they need to do. That's right. You got it. So with COVID, you're inheriting a great staff there at ABHE. You've already talked about a little bit your new Zoom room that you've got, but what are some of the other things that you see ABHE moving toward, and within the context of how Christian higher ed is changing? Yeah. So it's a great question to ask. It's like concurrent engineering, where you're coming in, inheriting where we are, but then also trying to determine where do we need to go.
And I think one of the things that Ralph has been able to do over the last, I'd say, 8 or 9 years is position ABHE. Of course, we're an accreditor. That's the main service that we provide. But there are so many other services that our colleges need beyond quality assurance. That's a critical piece. There's no question about it. And obviously for Title IV funding, it provides the gateway for students, et cetera, et cetera. Well, colleges need much more than that. And so we've developed really with board governance. I've done quite a bit of board consulting, and the number one thing, 9 times out of 10, the issues are lack of clear expectations from the board to the CEO or the CEO to the board, lack of a job description for the CEO or lack of a job description for the board. And that's usually where the problem is. So we've raised funds for it, where we actually do board training with their college president over a year period of time. So we have that going on. We also have targeted the C-suite and recognizing that there are distinct, lack of a better term, guilds within higher education, where you have CFOs, CAOs, COAs. You have a number of different titles that way. So we've provided a number of leadership development tracks that over a 2-year period of time, they go through a bit of a program through workshops at our annual meeting, as well as fall workshops, where, boy, a leader is so much better if all they're doing is just learning one thing that they can bring back to their institution and do differently. So we're trying to provide those platforms for those kinds of things to happen. And I want to grow it. As I'm looking to the future, boards important, no question about it. C-level, absolutely. C-suite, critical to the function of the institution. When you think about where the rubber meets the road within our colleges and universities, it's the student and the faculty member. Who spends the most time with the students? You can make an argument with your student development staff, student services, but from an academic perspective, it's the faculty member. So what are we doing as an organization to help our faculty members become better? And in my experience in higher education, we tend to hire the experts in the fields, and they are great experts in their fields. And they have, written a dissertation on a very specific subject matter. But have we trained them how to teach effectively in the classroom? And I would say it's a general statement, but generally speaking, our colleges and universities have not done a good job of pedagogy for our faculty. So I think there's a need there. There's a tremendous need that I'm not seeing too many people filling right now. So moving ahead vision-wise, boy, to have some sort, and it can't be face-to-face, right? Because the cost of bringing literally thousands of faculty members together for work, it's just not going to happen. So how do we leverage technology to be able to deliver some pedagogy training for our faculty members? So that's something that we're looking into moving forward.
Well, there's the other piece, and as you're talking about that, what came to mind is sins of the father, sins of the son. Mm-hmm. Typically, faculty members learn how to teach by how they were taught. You're the sage on the stage.
Yep.
Instead of being the guide on the side.
To me, I think it's more significant. We're right now involved in COVID issues, but beyond COVID as an immediate kind of emergency situation, I think what our faculty members do within the context of the classroom is the biggest shift that still needs to take place in higher education in order for higher education to be sustainable. These students are coming in with multiple methodologies to access and get information. That's not the issue. What we need to be doing is how do you process through that information and get true information? Mm-hmm. That's critical thinking. So it's shifting, and you're exactly right. It's how it was always done. The professor lecturing, and that just has to absolutely change. Yep.
The other piece and the other hole that I see out there, if we're looking really at faculty, is leadership training.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You've got faculty who come up who are experts in their field, mm-hmm. but leading a group of folks moving up into a department chair position or a dean position, if you've never been leading folks, it goes back to the sins of the father type of thing.
Yep.
And we don't do leadership training. In fact, I have found very, very few universities and colleges who do, regardless of whether secular or Christian, who do any kind of leadership development work for faculty.
Yeah. No, you've identified their equivalent over to business. They're middle management, right? A middle manager has to have a very unique skill set to be able to relate up and down and over. And you throw them into a chair position and expect that individual to flourish. It's just not going to happen. I, for a number of years, took my department chairs, rotated them just to a department chair conference, and just to encourage them when they were with colleagues from other institutions. Boy, that encouragement of, okay, yeah, you're struggling with that too. Well, how did you address it? Definitely helps. But yeah, I think the equivalent to business is if somebody is good on the line, one of the biggest mistakes businesses make is pulling that person off the line and putting them into a manager position where, hey, they were best at being on the line. Now you're putting them into an environment where they can't flourish and be successful. And I think the same thing happens in higher education where, hey, that they're a good professor. They have 3 PhDs. Well, surely they can be a department chair. Not necessarily.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. And if you want them there, then how are we going to train them to be effective as a department chair?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we've identified a couple of really big holes and great opportunities for ABHE.
For sure.
How do you see Christian higher ed changing?
Yeah.
We talked about the vision and the mission. Obviously, the environment has changed significantly. So things are changing, but I'm going to argue that the mission in some ways is changing as well, because higher ed has done a very poor job, at least in the eyes of their major stakeholders, the public, in training graduates to be job ready when they graduate.
Yeah. So the way I look at this, there are definitely trends within general higher education that affects us as a Bible college movement. So the umbrella of higher education, we're a very tiny sliver in that huge umbrella. So there are definitely national things that are happening from a higher ed movement that affect Bible colleges, enrollment trends, what you just mentioned, job readiness. Are they getting what they need in order to be successful in the business context? So all of those things, yes, those are very real. I think one of the growing issues is the soft skills, is EQ, emotional intelligence. Boy, you can train somebody to do something, but if they can't relate and build relationships, boy, they're just not going to be successful. So there's that's kind of missing in that mix. But for us as a sector, when I boil it down to the Bible college movement, which is really a subset under Christian higher education, our mandate we take very specifically from the Word of God, and that's to fulfill the Great Commission. That mission does not change. That's our perspective. That is what our institutions are doing, are preparing men and women to go and to make disciples, regardless of occupational context. That is our common thread. That's really what holds us together. And at the core of that is the church. And I think what a trend that has happened over the years is the Bible college movement and perhaps Christian higher education have distanced themselves from the church. And I think the time is now to have the conversations with the church and say, what is it that you need? What is it what you need from a staffing perspective? But what do you need from your parishioners too, as you're fulfilling your mission in the community in which God has placed you? That's, to me, one of the greatest challenges that's changing us, is saying, no, it used to be send a promising potential church leader to seminary, send them away, their family moves. They move into campus housing with their family, campus married student apartments, and they go away for 4 years, then they come back. And it was almost like the seminary was positioned like, well, we know what's best for those students. You give them to us for 4 years and we'll give them back to you. And that's totally changed. That methodology has changed. So I think the conversations that need to happen are going to pastors and saying, church, what do you need? What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? How do we link arms with you in this greater mission of the Great Commission? So that's where I contextualize it down to the Bible College. We are susceptible to every other trend that's out there in the broader higher education market, but then we have some unique ones as well as an organization.
Yeah. Well, I think what, as the saying goes, I think we're in violent agreement in that, it's Bible focused. Absolutely. It has to be that.
Yep.
But what we're talking about is the strategic planning that we talked about before we came on the air, that stakeholder input process.
Yes.
To where, what do you folks need from our graduates?
You got it.
For example, you've got folks who, they come to seminary and they get their DMin or whatever the degree is, and it's totally focused on the Bible, which is a critical piece of it. You've got to know the Bible backwards, forwards, etc.
Yep.
But you don't know nothing about how to run a church.
Right. You got it. The label I put on it, and it's I don't know why this happens, but it's colleges within the movement, within seminaries in general, they've theologized their methodology and saying it has to be done this way. And here's our theology as to why that's the case. You're missing the boat. You don't theologize methodology. I mean, you can certainly connect it to, but methodology has to change. Don't change the ends, but the means by which you achieve those. Boy, look at all of history. There's no way we're leading the church like we did in the book of Acts or in the New Testament church. Clearly, methodology has changed. So what do we need to change within our institutions that are systemic because we've always done it that way? When you can break that barrier and start having those conversations, it's a whole new day for theological education.
Absolutely. And as Einstein said, we can't solve problems from the same level of consciousness that created them.
There you go. I like it.
And so we're coming up to the end of our time, unfortunately. 3 takeaways for fellow presidents. What should university presidents be thinking about going forward?
First of all, I'd say to college presidents, I can't imagine a more difficult job. I can't think of an industry, perhaps healthcare is the equivalent, where you have so many stakeholders, so many voices, from governments to accreditors to alumni, students, faculty. It's coming from all different directions. So in the midst of all that noise, I'd say 3 things. 1, students first. You're not focused in on the needs of the students. Your success rate drops significantly. Always get the perspective of the students. As a president, you're several iterations removed from engaging with the students. But, they say the higher and higher you go in leadership, the fewer and fewer truth tellers you have around you. The students will tell you the truth. So they're a great resource. Second thing I'd say is always learn. Don't stop learning. Force yourself. This I did in my previous job as well as with my church board that I chaired here for a number of years. We always went outside of our context and learned. So we would take field trips. I would take the elders on a field trip in business contexts and say, hey, what can we learn from this industry that we can apply or do better within the church context? So take your leadership team out once COVID allows you to do it. Connect with some of the business connections you have. Take them on a tour of a factory. Take them on a tour of how that particular business person leads. Always learn, because there are principles that you can bring over that start to challenge that theologizing your methodology to say, hey, we actually can do this differently. And then the third thing is don't stop building relationships, genuine relationships. That's a lot of the job as a president, and some of that can be fake. Don't ever let it be fake. Build those deep, long-lasting relationships with your stakeholders because you need them. The day of a college president making all of the exclusive decisions for the institution are gone. And you need those voices, you need those relationships in order to lead effectively.
Oh, those are great. So what's next for you? What's next for ABHE?
Yeah, so it's great that you're asking that question. I have a staff retreat coming up next week. We're pulling together in the mountains of North Carolina and sequestering ourselves and getting to know each other. But we're starting really a brand new strategic planning process to identify what is it out there that we've got to be doing better as an organization to meet the needs. So that's going to be a critical time for us to start that process. And then we've got to engage, obviously, our stakeholders with that. Really seeing how best we can learn from our members so that we are actually meeting the stated needs of our membership. Let's not assume anything going into it. Let's have the conversations with college presidents, with the C-level, with faculty members. How best can we serve our constituency? We don't want it to just always be about accreditation. Again, that's a critical piece, but also important are developing the leaders on the campus. So we've got to do a better job of that moving forward. So that's what we have in our future.
Well, that's great. At our firm, we say that accreditation is just the affirmation of a good institution.
There you go. Exactly right. And it tends to be backwards looking as opposed to forwards looking. There are aspects to it for sure with strategic planning, but it tends to be retrospective, and I think both play very, very well together as we meet the needs of our membership.
As they should.
Yeah.
So, Philip, thank you so much for being a guest. It's great to have you on board.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the time.
Thanks for listening this week. And a special thank you to this week's special guest, Dr. Philip Dearborn, President of the Association of Biblical Higher Education, and for his sharing his insights on Christian higher ed and what's next for ABHE. Our next guest is Goodwin University President Mark Scheinberg, who's led Goodwin since its founding in 1999. Mark is on the cutting edge of higher ed, and he'll be discussing how he's built an alliance among Goodwin, Sacred Heart, and Pear to take over a number of the University of Bridgeport's academic programs and thus save it from financial difficulties. A real good test case on what's actually working in higher ed.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drum McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.